In this gripping story about racism, Dr. Simone Bennett, a successful black surgeon, returns to her hometown and uncovers rampant corruption and deep-seated racism within its leadership. She becomes the target of Deputy Hawthorne, a racist cop who abuses his power to silence her after she exposes systemic injustices, including stolen public funds and targeted oppression. Facing unjust arrests, intimidation, and threats, Simone's fight reveals the horrifying extent of prejudice in her community. This infuriating tale of abuse and resilience highlights the realities of racism in America and the courage required to stand up against an unjust system. The sun had just begun its descent over the skyline of Rosefield, casting long golden shadows across the quiet streets. It was the kind of town where storefronts still had painted signs, and shopkeepers waved at passers-by they knew by name. But beneath its picture-perfect surface, the cracks were deep, hidden like the roots of an old tree clutching fractured earth. Detective Elise Warren parked her aging sedan outside the police station, her nerves coiled tight. It was her first day back in Rosefield after nearly a decade away, and the weight of her return pressed heavy on her shoulders. She had left as a young officer, eager, idealistic, and determined to make a difference. Now she was older, tougher, and painfully aware of the system's flaws. Inside the station, she felt the shift in atmosphere as soon as she walked through the door. Conversations, hushed eyes darted away, only to sneak glances when they thought she wasn't looking. She wasn't here to make friends, though not anymore. Captain Frank Maddox greeted her with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Detective Warren," he said, extending a hand she didn't take. "Welcome back. Hope you're ready to hit the ground running." "Always," Elise replied, her voice clipped. She didn't trust Maddox, not after what she'd heard about him from the sidelines, the whispers of cover-ups, favors exchanged under the table, and the quiet burying of complaints. She didn't have concrete proof yet, but she could feel it in the way his gaze lingered a second too long, measuring her like a pawn in a game she didn't know the rules to yet. As Maddox handed her a stack of old case files, Elise noticed the folder on the bottom. A plain manila cover, with a single word scrawled in red marker: "Closed." Her instincts flared. Cases didn't end in Rosefield, they disappeared. "Start with these," Maddox said, his tone casual. "Just routine reviews should help you get reacquainted with the town." Elise nodded, keeping her expression neutral, but as soon as she was alone, she opened the closed file. The photos inside hit her like a gut punch: a missing teen, a mother pleading for answers, and a list of witness statements that didn't add up. The date on the last entry was 7 years ago, just before the file was shelved. Elise felt her chest tighten. She knew this case. She had worked it briefly before she left. The girl's name was Abigail Reed, and she had vanished without a trace. The edges of Elise's memories sharpened. The family's tears, the rushed interviews, the town's growing unease, all of it had been swept away, as if Abigail's existence were nothing more than a forgotten shadow. Elise clenched her fists. This wasn't a case of negligence. This was a cover-up. She closed the file and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Abigail wasn't just another name in a pile of unsolved cases. She was the reason Elise had returned to Rosefield, and now, she was going to find out who had buried the truth, and why. The low hum of conversation and clinking utensils filled the air at Jackie's Diner, a corner spot nestled in the heart of Willow Creek. The smell of fresh coffee and buttery pancakes wafted through the space, mingling with the faint notes of a country tune playing on the jukebox. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, the town's pulse dictated by the rise and fall of regulars slipping into their usual booths. Dr. Simone Bennett folded her hands around a ceramic mug, the chipped handle smooth from decades of use. She took a slow sip of the diner's signature coffee, thick, slightly bitter, but comfortingly familiar. It wasn't the imported blends she had at home, or the pour-over perfection from the cafes near her hospital in Chicago. But Jackie's brew came with a certain nostalgia, and for Simone, it was worth the trip every time she visited her hometown. "Good to see you back, Doc," said Jackie, her voice warm as she wiped down the counter nearby. "You've been away too long." Simone offered a small smile, tucking a loose curl of her black hair behind her ear. "Work keeps me busy, but Willow Creek has a way of pulling me back." Jackie grinned, her cheeks flushed as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Well, Folks here are mighty proud of you. You know, a girl from our little town running a whole surgical department in Chicago. Can't get better than that." Simone nodded modestly. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the praise, she just didn't let it define her. She hadn't returned to Willow Creek for recognition. Her quiet visits were her way of staying grounded, of remembering where she'd come from and the people who had shaped her. She glanced around the diner, taking in the worn vinyl booths and walls lined with faded photographs. This place hadn't changed much since her childhood, though many of the faces had Jackie, still spry in her 60s, was one of the few constants. Simone's gaze landed on a table in the corner where 3 men sat, their voices low but their eyes frequently darting toward her. She was used to the stares, the murmurs. Wealth and power often attracted attention, but in Willow Creek, it was something more. To many here, her success was both a marvel and a mystery. "Can I top that off for you?" Jackie asked, breaking Simone's thoughts. "No, thank you, I'm good," Simone replied, setting the mug down. "I'm just waiting for someone." The someone she was waiting for was her younger brother, Darnell. Always late, always unapologetic, Darnell had inherited their father's knack for charming his way out of trouble. It was something Simone envied in him. Her path had been one of relentless effort, each accomplishment hard-won, while Darnell seemed to glide through life, relying on his wit and charisma. Despite their differences, he was her anchor, a connection to a simpler, more carefree version of herself. She glanced at the clock above the counter. 5 minutes past their agreed time. Typical. As she waited, the door swung open, letting in a gust of December air. A man entered, his boots heavy on the worn wooden floor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the kind of uniform that immediately changed the room's energy, a deputy sheriff. His badge gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights, but it was the hard set of his jaw and the way his eyes swept the room that caught Simone's attention. He wasn't from around here. That much was clear. Willow Creek's local law enforcement were a familiar, if not always comforting, presence. This man carried himself differently, as if he was used to being the authority in any room he entered. His gaze landed on Simone, and his brow furrowed slightly before he turned toward the counter. "Coffee black," he said to Jackie, his voice curt. Jackie, unbothered by his demeanor, poured a fresh cup. "Passing through, deputy?" "Transferred here last month," he said, not elaborating. Simone shifted in her seat, sensing his gaze flicker back to her. She kept her expression neutral, sipping her coffee as if oblivious. She didn't want to assume anything, but years of navigating spaces where her presence wasn't expected had honed her instincts. Something about the way he looked at her wasn't just casual curiosity. It was calculated, assessing. The bell above the door jingled again, and Darnell strode in, his usual grin firmly in place. He was dressed casually, jeans and a leather jacket, but the confidence in his stride made him seem taller than his actual height. "Hey sis," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Sorry I'm late, ran into Mrs. Calloway on the way here. You know how she loves to talk." Simone smirked. "She does have a talent for it." Darnell flagged Jackie down and ordered a plate of waffles. As he settled in, his gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on the deputy at the counter. "New guy?" Darnell asked in a low voice. "Apparently," Simone replied. Darnell's eyes narrowed slightly. "He's got that look." Simone raised an eyebrow. "What look?" "You know that look some of them get when they see us sitting where we're not supposed to be." Simone didn't respond immediately. She understood what Darnell meant, but she preferred not to jump to conclusions. Still, there was no denying that certain assumptions followed them wherever they went. It didn't matter that Simone could buy this entire diner if she wanted to, or that her name was etched onto plaques in hospitals across the country. To some, she would always be out of place. As if on cue, the deputy turned, his coffee in hand, and approached their booth. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, sir," he said with a nod. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a formality that felt out of place in the diner's otherwise easygoing atmosphere. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Deputy Hawthorne." Simone gave a small nod. "Dr. Bennett," she replied, her tone equally formal, "and this is my brother, Darnell." Hawthorne's brow furrowed slightly at the title. "Doctor?" he repeated, as if testing the word. Yes, Simone said evenly. I'm a surgeon visiting from Chicago. Chicago? Hawthorne echoed. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, before shifting to Darnell. You from out of town too? Darnell leaned back in his seat, his grin sharpening. Born and raised right here, Deputy Y. Hawthorne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the diner, as if taking inventory of the space. No reason, he said finally. Just making conversation. Simone felt the tension simmering under the surface, but she kept her expression calm. It's good to see new faces in town, she said, steering the conversation toward neutral ground. Hawthorne nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. Enjoy your meal, he said curtly before returning to the counter. Darnell waited until Hawthorne was out of earshot before leaning forward. That guy's trouble, he muttered. You don't know that, Simone replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. I know his type, Darnell said. They see us and start wondering why we're here, why we're dressed like this, why we're sitting in booths instead of bussing tables. Simone sighed, stirring her coffee absently. Maybe, or maybe he's just new and trying to figure out the lay of the land. Darnell shook his head. You always try to see the best in people, sis, but you need to watch out folks like him, don't care how many degrees you've got, or how many awards you've won. They see what they want to see. Simone didn't respond. She knew Darnell was speaking from experience, and she couldn't dismiss his words outright. Still, she refused to let suspicion dictate her actions. For now, she would keep her head down and her eyes open. But something about Deputy Hawthorne lingered in her mind, like the first low rumble of a storm gathering on the horizon. The morning in Willow Creek dragged on, the quiet town slipping into its familiar rhythm. At Jackie's diner, Simone and Darnell finished their meal, their conversation moving to lighter topics. The interaction with Deputy Hawthorne lingered in the back of Simone's mind, but she pushed it aside. She was used to these subtle moments, those pauses, the questioning glances. They had followed her all her life, even as she had climbed to heights that few could imagine. But no matter how far she rose, some people would always see her as an outsider. As they stood to leave, Darnell's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and groaned. I've got to run, he said. Mrs. Calloway's water heater is acting up again. If I don't fix it today, I'll never hear the end of it. Simone chuckled softly. Sounds like you've got a busy day. Same to you, Darnell replied, giving her a mock salute. Be careful, all right? You've been gone a long time, and this town hasn't exactly gotten friendlier. I'll be fine, Simone assured him, though her brother's words stuck with her as she walked to her car. Simone drove to the Willow Creek Community Center, a modest brick building at the edge of town. It housed everything from a small library to a makeshift courtroom that handled minor civil disputes. Today, Simone had an appointment to meet with a local contractor about renovations for the center, a project she had agreed to fund anonymously months ago. The parking lot was nearly empty when she arrived inside. The air smelled faintly of old books and cleaning solution. A receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, directing her to the conference room where the contractor was waiting. Simone straightened her blazer and stepped inside. The man seated at the table stood as she entered, his hand outstretched. He was middle-aged, with a ruddy complexion and a thick build that suggested years of physical labor. Dr. Bennett, he said, his voice warm but slightly cautious. I'm Mark Riley. It's a pleasure to meet you. Likewise, Simone replied, shaking his hand. They sat across from each other, the table between them stacked with blueprints and material samples. As they began discussing the project, Mark's initial reserve melted away. Simone's knowledge of the work surprised him. She spoke confidently about structural updates and material costs, having done her research thoroughly. I've got to admit, Mark said after a while, leaning back in his chair. When I first heard the donor was coming in person, I didn't expect someone like you. Simone raised an eyebrow, though her tone remained neutral. What do you mean by that? Mark hesitated, his cheeks reddening slightly. Oh, nothing bad, just... I figured it'd be some older guy in a suit, you know, the kind who likes to throw money around but doesn't really care about the work. Simone nodded slowly. Well, I care about this community. That's why I'm here. Mark offered an apologetic smile, sensing he had stepped too close to an invisible line. "And it's appreciated. Believe me, this place could use more folks like you." The meeting ended on a cordial note, but Simone couldn't shake the subtle undercurrent of surprise in Mark's words. It wasn't the first time someone had been taken aback by her presence, and it wouldn't be the last. She was used to proving herself in rooms where people didn't expect her to belong. Still, the weight of it was exhausting. As she stepped out into the parking lot, she noticed a squad car parked a few spaces down. Deputy Hawthorne leaned against it, his arms crossed, and his expression unreadable. He straightened as she approached, stepping into her path with a forced smile. "Dr. Bennett," he said, as if testing the title again. "We meet again." Simone stopped, her posture calm but alert. "Deputy Hawthorne, can I help you with something?" He gestured vaguely toward the building behind her. "I heard you were in town, making some big moves. Thought I'd stop by and see what all the fuss was about." Simone's jaw tightened, but her tone remained polite. "I wasn't aware my business was the subject of such interest." Hawthorne chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Small town, ma'am. People talk. Just wanted to make sure everything's on the up and up." Simone held his gaze, refusing to flinch under his thinly veiled suspicion. "I assure you, Deputy, everything I do is above board." Hawthorne's smile faded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll hold you to that." Simone stepped around him without another word, her heels clicking against the pavement. As she reached her car, she could feel his gaze on her back, heavy and unrelenting. The afternoon passed uneventfully. Simone spent hours at her family's old home, reviewing paperwork for her hospital in Chicago and catching up with her mother over tea. It wasn't until evening that the day's events came rushing back, her brother's warning echoing in her mind. After dinner, Simone decided to visit the Willow Creek Mall, a small shopping center on the outskirts of town. She needed a few things for the week ahead, and hoped the quiet activity might help clear her head. The mall was nearly empty when she arrived, its stores illuminated by soft fluorescent light. Simone wandered into an upscale boutique, her fingers brushing over racks of neatly arranged clothing. She was admiring a silk scarf when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am." She turned to see a store associate approaching, her expression polite but guarded. "Yes?" Simone replied. "I just wanted to let you know we don't allow bags in the store," the associate said, nodding toward Simone's designer tote. Simone blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I wasn't aware of that policy." "It's posted near the entrance," the associate replied, her tone firmer now. "You'll need to leave it at the counter if you want to continue shopping." Simone's gaze shifted to the entrance, where no such sign was visible. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "Is that policy enforced with all customers, or just some?" The associate's cheeks reddened, but she didn't back down. "It's standard practice, ma'am." Simone smiled tightly, placing the scarf back on the rack. "Then I'll take my business elsewhere." As she walked out, she noticed two other customers entering the store, their large purses swinging at their sides. Neither was stopped. By the time Simone returned to her car, her calm facade was cracking. The day had been a series of small, cutting moments, each one sharpening the edges of her frustration. She had spent her life proving her worth, surpassing every expectation placed in her path, and yet here she was, still being questioned, still being underestimated, still being judged by the color of her skin before anything else. She rested her head against the steering wheel, letting the quiet hum of the parking lot settle over her. Anger simmered just beneath the surface, but she knew better than to let it boil over. She had learned long ago that her emotions could be weaponized against her, that even the slightest display of frustration could be twisted into a narrative of aggressiveness. Simone sat up, straightening her shoulders. She wouldn't let them win. Not today, not ever. She started the car and pulled out of the lot, her mind already churning with plans for the next steps. Willow Creek was her hometown, but it had never truly felt like home. Maybe it was time to change that. The cold night air bit at Simone's cheeks as she stepped out of her car, the streetlights casting long shadows over the Willow Creek Community Center parking lot. She hadn't planned on coming back here tonight, but an email she received during dinner had changed everything. It was a terse message from Mark Riley, the contractor she'd met earlier, asking to meet urgently about the project. His tone suggested something was wrong. Simone had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they told her this wasn't just about renovations. Her heart thrummed with a mix of caution and determination as she approached the building's glass doors. Inside, the dim lighting of the lobby reflected a faint glow off the polished tile floors. She spotted Mark near the entrance, his face pale and lined with worry. "Mark," Simone called softly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. He turned sharply, his eyes darting past her to the empty lot beyond. "Dr. Bennett," he said in a hushed voice. "Thanks for coming. I didn't know who else to call." "What's going on?" she asked, scanning his face for answers. Mark hesitated, wringing his hands. "It's about the project. I was reviewing the old permits and records like you asked, and I found something." Simone frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark glanced over his shoulder before leaning closer. "There's been money missing for years. Thousands of dollars that were supposed to go into this place. It's all in the paperwork. Inflated invoices, shell companies, and someone in the town council signed off on it. Someone high up." Simone's stomach tightened. Corruption in small-town governance wasn't unheard of, but hearing it confirmed was another matter entirely. "Do you know who's behind it?" Mark nodded, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Deputy Mayor Ellis, and it gets worse. I think the sheriff's office has been involved, covering up complaints from people who've tried to speak out." The weight of his words settled over her like a stone. This wasn't just mismanagement or incompetence, it was deliberate theft, facilitated by those in power. It explained the hostility she had felt ever since stepping foot back in Willow Creek. The sideways glances, the dismissive comments, the thinly veiled suspicion. She wasn't just an outsider, she was a threat. Before Simone could respond, the sound of a car engine pierced the quiet. Both she and Mark turned toward the parking lot as a squad car pulled in, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Deputy Hawthorne stepped out, his silhouette framed by the harsh glare of the lights. He adjusted his belt as he approached, his expression unreadable. Two other officers exited the vehicle behind him, their postures tense. "Evening, Dr. Bennett," Hawthorne said, his tone heavy with false politeness. "Didn't expect to see you here this late." Simone felt her pulse quicken, but she held her ground. "I could say the same about you, Deputy. Is there a problem?" Hawthorne's lips twitched into a smirk. "We got a call about suspicious activity at the community center. Thought we'd check it out." "Suspicious activity?" Simone repeated, her voice steady but sharp. "I was invited here by Mr. Riley to discuss renovations for the building. Hardly suspicious." Hawthorne's gaze flickered to Mark, who looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. "That true, Mr. Riley?" Hawthorne asked, his tone cool. Mark swallowed hard, glancing nervously between Simone and the officers. Yes, Enough," Hawthorne cut him off, his voice hardening. "This property is closed after hours. You're trespassing, Dr. Bennett." Simone's jaw tightened. "I have every right to be here. If there's an issue, I'd be happy to speak with your supervisor." Hawthorne chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "That won't be necessary. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The words hit Simone like a blow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Hawthorne said, his hand moving to the cuffs on his belt. "You're under arrest for trespassing and obstruction." "This is absurd," Simone snapped, her composure finally cracking. "I haven't done anything wrong." Mark stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Deputy, this isn't necessary. She's telling the truth." "Stay out of it," one of the other officers barked, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Mark froze, his face draining of color. Simone took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. Her mind raced through her options, but she knew better than to escalate the situation. Years of experience had taught her the dangers of pushing back against authority, no matter how unjust. Slowly, she raised her hands. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice steady but cold. "And you'll regret it." Hawthorne's smirk widened as he stepped closer, pulling her hands behind her back and snapping the cuffs on with unnecessary force. "We'll see about that," he muttered. The ride to the station was silent. The tension thick enough to choke on Simone sat in the back of the squad car, her wrists aching from the cuffs. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to keep her anger in check. Losing control wouldn't help her now. At the station, she was led inside under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. A few officers glanced up as she passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. None of them intervened. Hawthorne guided her to a desk, where a tired-looking officer sat filling out paperwork. "We've got a trespasser," Hawthorne announced, his tone almost gleeful. The officer glanced at Simone, his brow furrowing. "Wait, she's the doctor from Chicago, right? The one working on the community center?" "Doesn't matter who she is," Hawthorne snapped. "She broke the law." Simone met the officer's gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "You know this is wrong." The officer hesitated, but Hawthorne's glare silenced him. He sighed and began typing on his computer. An hour passed. Simone sat in a holding cell, the cold metal bench digging into her back. Her mind churned with a mix of fury and resolve. She wasn't just angry for herself. She was angry for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or crushed under the weight of this town's corruption. She had tried to stay under the radar, to make her impact quietly. But they had made their move, and now it was her turn. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and Simone looked up as the cell door opened. To her surprise, Mark Riley stepped inside, flanked by another officer, this one older, with a worn face and kind eyes. "Dr. Bennett," the officer said, unlocking the cuffs. "You're free to go." "What changed?" Simone asked, rubbing her wrists as she stood. Mark stepped forward, his voice firm despite his obvious nervousness. "I went to the press." Simone blinked. "You what?" "I couldn't just sit by and let this happen," Mark said. "I sent copies of the records I found to a reporter I know they're running the story tomorrow." Simone stared at him, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. "That was a risk." Mark shrugged, his expression grim. "Someone had to take it." The older officer cleared his throat. "Word's already spreading. You've got allies, Dr. Bennett. Don't let them scare you off." Simone nodded, her resolve hardening. "I won't." As Simone stepped out into the cool night air, she knew this was far from over. Hawthorne and his ilk wouldn't back down easily, and neither would the forces protecting them. But now, the battle lines were clear. This wasn't just about the community center or her own reputation, it was about the soul of Willow Creek, about standing up to the rot that had festered here for far too long. Simone glanced at Mark, who stood by her side, his shoulders squared despite his obvious fear. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. "What now?" "Now," Simone said, her voice steady. "We fight." The next morning, the front page of the Willow Creek Gazette sent shockwaves through the town. The headline read, "Corruption in Willow Creek. Deputy Mayor and Law Enforcement under fire for alleged misconduct." Simone stared at the paper in her mother's kitchen, her coffee growing cold on the table. Below the headline were excerpts from the documents Mark had sent to the press. Itemized payouts, doctored invoices, and a staggering amount of public funds redirected into private hands. The article named Deputy Mayor Ellis directly and hinted at law enforcement's involvement, though it stopped short of naming specific officers. The Gazette's editor had clearly been careful, unwilling to print unverified accusations about the sheriff's department. But the implication was there, and anyone who'd been following the whispers around town could connect the dots. The phone on the counter rang, breaking the silence. Simone's mother, Ruth, hurried over to answer it. "Hello. Yes, she's here. One moment." Ruth held out the phone, her expression uneasy. "It's Mark." Simone took the receiver, already bracing herself. "Mark?" His voice was frantic on the other end. "Simone, they're coming after me." "What do you mean?" "I've been getting calls all morning. Threats. Someone slashed my tires last night, and now there's a car parked outside my house, just sitting there. I don't know what to do." Simone felt a sharp pang of guilt. Mark had taken a risk standing by her, and now he was paying for it. "Mark, listen to me. Stay inside and lock your doors. I'll be there as soon as I can." "Do you think I should call the police?" Simone hesitated. "Not yet. Let me come by first. I'll bring someone with me." After hanging up, she turned to Ruth. "I need to go." Her mother's eyes narrowed with worry. "Is this about the article, Simone? These people? They don't play fair. You're stirring up a hornet's nest." "I don't have a choice, Mama," Simone said, grabbing her coat. "This isn't just about me anymore." Ruth sighed, crossing her arms. "Just be careful, and don't let them bait you into something you can't come back from." Simone pulled into Mark's driveway 20 minutes later, with Darnell in the passenger seat. She had called her brother on the way, knowing his presence would be a comfort and a deterrent to anyone thinking of starting trouble. Mark opened the door the moment they arrived, his face pale and drawn. "They left," he said, motioning toward the now empty street. "But they were out there for hours." Simone stepped inside, scanning the room. Mark's house was modest but tidy, the living room cluttered with blueprints and project notes. He gestured toward the couch, but Simone remained standing. "Mark, this is going to get worse before it gets better," she said bluntly. "They're trying to intimidate you, and they'll keep pushing until you break or fight back." Mark rubbed his temples, his hands trembling. "I don't know if I can do this. My wife's scared. My kids keep asking why people are mad at me. Maybe I should just back off." Darnell, leaning against the doorframe, spoke up. "You think they'll stop if you back off, nah? They'll just make sure you never talk again." Simone placed a hand on Mark's arm. "You've already done the hardest part, Mark. You told the truth. Now we have to see this through." Mark looked at her, his expression uncertain. "How they have the sheriff, the mayor, probably half the council who's going to listen to us." Simone's jaw tightened. "We make them listen." Later that afternoon, Simone called a meeting at the community center. A handful of people showed up, local activists, business owners, and a few residents who had read the Gazette article and wanted answers. Among them was Mitchell Harper, a retired lawyer who had been quietly advocating for reform in Willow Creek for years. "I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish here," Mitchell said, his voice measured but skeptical. "Even if you have the evidence, people like Ellis don't go down without a fight. They have resources, connections." Simone interrupted, her voice steady. "And we have the truth. I'm not naive, Mr. Harper. I know the risks, and I know what we're up against, but the longer we stay silent, the longer they keep winning." Mitchell studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. What's your plan?" "We need to apply pressure," Simone said, addressing the room. "Public pressure. The Gazette article was a start, but we need to go bigger. Town hall meetings, social media, letters to state officials, whatever it takes to make sure this story doesn't get buried." A young woman near the back raised her hand. "What if they come after us, like they did with Mark?" "They will," Simone admitted. "But that's why we stand together. If we let fear control us, they've already won." As the meeting ended, Simone lingered to speak with Mitchell. His sharp eyes betrayed a hint of curiosity behind his reserved demeanor. "You're serious about this," he said, almost as a statement. "Completely." Mitchell gave a small nod. "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone who thought they could change the world." "Did they?" "They tried," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "But they didn't have backup. Make sure you do." That night, Simone drove home with Darnell. The conversation at the community center had lit a spark of hope. But she knew it wasn't enough. The system they were fighting was deeply entrenched, and the people protecting it would stop at nothing to maintain their power. As she turned onto her street, she noticed a black SUV parked near her driveway. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral as she pulled into the garage. "Stay here," she told Darnell, stepping out of the car. The SUV's driver's side door opened, and Deputy Hawthorne stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his expression calm. Too calm. He waited as Simone approached, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "Evening, Dr. Bennett," he said. "Deputy," she replied evenly. "Something I can help you with?" Hawthorne took a step closer, his hands resting casually on his belt. "Just thought I'd check in, see how you're settling back into town. Lot of buzz about you these days." "I'm sure there is," Simone said, her voice cold. "But if you're here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time." Hawthorne's smirk widened. "Intimidate? That's a strong word. I'm just doing my job." "And what job would that be, harassing private citizens on their own property?" Hawthorne's eyes narrowed slightly. "Careful, doctor. You don't want to make this personal." Simone stepped closer, her gaze unflinching. "It's already personal. You made it personal when you arrested me without cause, when you targeted Mark Riley and his family, when you stood by while this town's leadership stole from its people. So don't pretend you're here out of concern." For a moment, Hawthorne's mask slipped. His smirk faltered, replaced by something colder, more dangerous. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said quietly. Simone held his gaze, her voice firm. "Neither do you." As Hawthorne returned to his SUV and drove off, Simone felt a mix of relief and adrenaline. She wasn't afraid of him, not anymore, but she knew this was far from over. When she stepped back inside, Darnell was waiting by the door, his arms crossed. What did he want? "To scare me," Simone said simply. "It didn't work." Darnell frowned. "Simone, these people don't play fair. You need to be ready for whatever they throw at you." "I am," she said, her resolve hardening. "They've been running this town unchecked for too long, it's time someone held them accountable." Darnell nodded, his expression softening. "All right then, let's show them they messed with the wrong woman." The Willow Creek Town Hall was filled to capacity, its aged wooden benches creaking under the weight of the crowd. Word of Simone's fight against the corruption in Willow Creek had spread like wildfire, and the room buzzed with tension. Townsfolk of all ages were packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of hope, curiosity, and trepidation. At the front of the room, a long table stretched across the dais, where Deputy Mayor Ellis, Sheriff Bryant, and a handful of council members sat in stiff silence. Their expressions betrayed little, but their eyes flicked to the crowd and then to Simone with increasing unease. Simone stood at the lectern, her presence commanding, despite the undercurrent of hostility from the officials. Her tailored blazer and calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the fiery determination in her voice. "We're here tonight," she began, her voice steady but forceful, "because the people of Willow Creek deserve answers. They deserve better than stolen resources, corrupt leadership, and a justice system that serves only itself." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, but Simone pressed on. Her focus was unyielding, her words cutting through the room like a scalpel. "For years, this town has operated under a veil of silence, but thanks to brave individuals willing to speak out, the truth is coming to light. The financial documents leaked to the press are just the beginning. They reveal a pattern of theft and abuse that runs deep, implicating people in this very room." She turned her gaze to Ellis, whose jaw clenched so tightly it seemed about to crack. Sheriff Bryant's face reddened, a vein pulsing at his temple. "You've made serious accusations, Dr. Bennett," Ellis interrupted, his voice oily and composed. "But accusations alone don't prove anything. This town has a long history of baseless claims by individuals looking to disrupt the hard work of its leaders." Simone didn't flinch. "The documents speak for themselves, Deputy Mayor. And if they aren't enough, perhaps the testimony of Mark Riley, a whistleblower with first-hand knowledge of the corruption, will add some clarity." All eyes turned to Mark, who sat near the front of the crowd. His face was pale, but he gave a firm nod. Ellis smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Testimony from a disgruntled contractor, hardly reliable. What's next, Dr. Bennett? Are you planning to accuse every official in Willow Creek of wrongdoing?" "Only the guilty ones," Simone replied sharply, earning a smattering of applause from the crowd. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Simone turned her attention to Sheriff Bryant, who had remained silent until now. "And you, Sheriff, your department has played a critical role in silencing dissent and protecting those in power. Care to explain why?" Bryant's eyes narrowed, his voice a low growl. "Watch your tone, Doctor. You're not in Chicago anymore around here. We don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up trouble." Simone stepped closer to the lectern, her eyes blazing. "I'm not stirring up trouble, I'm exposing it, and the people of Willow Creek have a right to know why their leaders have betrayed their trust." The room erupted into noise, half the crowd cheering, the other half murmuring uneasily. Ellis raised a hand to quiet them, but before he could speak, the heavy doors at the back of the hall swung open. Deputy Hawthorne strode in, his boots echoing against the floor. His uniform was immaculate, but his face was a mask of barely restrained fury. "I've had enough of this circus," Hawthorne barked, marching toward the front of the room. "This woman doesn't know her place." Simone turned to face him, her spine straight. "Deputy Hawthorne, this is a public forum. If you have something to contribute, I suggest you do so respectfully." Hawthorne sneered, stepping closer. "Respect? You think you deserve respect? Coming here, Accusing decent folks of crimes you can't even prove. People like you ruin towns like this." The words hung in the air, a stark revelation of the hatred simmering beneath his polished exterior. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and a woman near the back whispered, "Did he really just say that?" Simone felt the heat of anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice dangerously calm. "You mean people who demand accountability? Or do you mean something else, Deputy?" Hawthorne's face darkened, but before he could respond, Mitchell Harper stepped forward from the crowd. The retired lawyer's voice was sharp and commanding. "Deputy Hawthorne, I suggest you choose your next words carefully. Your prejudice is showing." The tension in the room escalated further, the crowd now fully engaged. Some people shouted in support of Simone, others argued loudly with their neighbors. Ellis pounded a gavel against the table, but it did little to quiet the growing unrest. Simone seized the moment. "This is exactly what I've been fighting against," she said, raising her voice to be heard over the din. "The corruption, the prejudice, the abuse of power, it's all on display right here, right now, and it's time we put an end to it." Hawthorne lunged forward, his hand reaching for Simone's arm. "You need to leave," he growled. "Now!" Before he could make contact, Darnell stepped between them, his stance protective. "Touch her, and you'll regret it," he warned, his voice low and firm. Hawthorne hesitated, his eyes flicking to the crowd, where several people were now recording the confrontation on their phones. Realizing he was being watched, he let his hand fall, but the rage in his eyes was unmistakable. Ellis rose from his seat, his voice strained as he tried to regain control. "Enough. This meeting is over." "No, it's not," Simone countered, her voice rising above his. "You don't get to silence me or the people of this town, just because you're afraid of the truth." She turned to the crowd, her voice ringing with conviction. "This fight isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about the people who've been ignored, cheated, and silenced for too long. We have the power to change this town, but it starts with holding those in power accountable." The crowd erupted into cheers, the noise drowning out Ellis's protests. Hawthorne, his face flushed with frustration, turned and stormed out of the room. As the meeting adjourned, Simone was surrounded by a wave of supporters, their energy reinvigorating her resolve. But she knew the fight was far from over. Ellis and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight, and Hawthorne's parting glare promised retaliation. Outside, the cool night air felt electric. With possibility, Darnell walked beside her, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "You really lit a fire in there." "It's not enough," Simone said. "We need more evidence, more support. This is just the beginning." As they reached her car, a voice called out from the shadows, "Dr. Bennett." Simone turned to see Mitchell Harper approaching, his face serious. "That was impressive," he said. "But you need to be careful, they're going to come after you harder now." "I'm ready," Simone replied. Mitchell shook his head. "You can't fight this alone. Let me help." Simone studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's take them down." Simone stepped into the fluorescent-lit halls of the Willow Creek Police Department, with her head held high. The buzz of chatter fell to a hush as officers turned to watch her pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Her pulse hammered in her chest, but her resolve was steady. She had spent the past week gathering more evidence, working with Mitchell Harper and the few brave voices in town willing to come forward tonight. She wasn't just demanding answers, she was delivering them. Deputy Hawthorne waited for her in the station's main lobby, leaning casually against the front desk. His smirk was razor-sharp, his posture dripping with confidence. The moment he saw her, his eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a mockery of a smile. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his tone mocking. "This is a surprise. Didn't expect you'd be bold enough to show your face here again." Simone stopped a few feet from him, her gaze locked on his. "And I didn't expect you'd still be standing here after everything you've done. Guess we're both full of surprises." Hawthorne's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Watch your tone, Doctor. You don't want to make this worse for yourself." "I'm not the one making it worse," Simone said, stepping closer. Her voice was calm, measured, but it carried a weight that made even the nearby officers shift uncomfortably. "I know about the cover-ups, the threats, the false arrests, and I know you've been at the center of it all." Hawthorne straightened, his hand brushing the baton on his belt. Careful, Bennett, accusations like that can land you in trouble. Trouble? Simone's voice rose, carrying across the room. The only trouble here is you and the rest of this department protecting a system that preys on the very people it's supposed to serve. Hawthorne's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward, towering over her. His voice dropped to a low growl. You think you're better than us, don't you? Just because you've got fancy degrees and a big city job, but out here, you're nobody. And nobody tells me how to do my job. The air in the room grew thick with tension, the officers frozen as they watched the exchange. Simone felt the anger simmering beneath her composure, but she refused to let it break through. Instead, she met Hawthorne's glare with unshakable determination. Your job, she said slowly, is to protect this community, not to intimidate it, not to silence it, and definitely not to serve your own interests. The doors behind her burst open, and Mitchell Harper entered, his expression grim but resolute. He held a thick manila envelope in one hand, which he raised for all to see. Deputy Hawthorne, Mitchell called, his voice carrying across the room. I believe you'll want to see this. Hawthorne turned, his confidence faltering as Mitchell approached. What's this supposed to be? He snapped. Proof, Mitchell said, placing the envelope on the counter. Proof of your involvement in illegal activities, including falsified police reports, misuse of department funds, and coercion of witnesses. The room erupted in murmurs, officers exchanging uneasy glances. Hawthorne's face darkened, his composure slipping as he reached for the envelope. This is a joke, he muttered, flipping through the documents. His hands trembled slightly as he scanned the pages, bank statements, emails, and signed reports that painted a damning picture. Where did you get this? From people who are tired of living in fear, Simone said, her voice cutting through the noise. Mark Riley, Maria Vasquez, and others who've seen firsthand what you and your allies have done. Hawthorne's eyes darted between the papers and Simone, his expression a volatile mix of anger and desperation. You think this will stick? You think anyone's going to believe this over me? They already do, Mitchell said. The evidence is being submitted to the state attorney general's office as we speak, and once the media gets hold of it, you won't have anywhere to hide. The color drained from Hawthorne's face, but his fear quickly gave way to fury. You're making a mistake, he hissed, stepping toward Simone. You don't understand how things work here, people like me. We're the ones who keep this town running. Without us, this place would fall apart. Simone didn't back down. You mean without your lies and corruption, I think this town will do just fine. Hawthorne's hand twitched toward his baton, and for a tense moment, the room held its breath. Then Sheriff Bryant's booming voice cut through the standoff. That's enough. The sheriff stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. His face was flushed, his eyes darting between Simone and Hawthorne. Sheriff, Hawthorne began, his voice unsteady. They're lying. They're trying to... Bryant raised a hand to silence him. I've seen enough, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. The documents speak for themselves, Deputy. Hawthorne's mouth opened and closed, his words failing him, as Bryant turned to the other officers. Take him into custody. The room erupted in gasps and whispers as two officers stepped forward, their hesitation evident. Hawthorne backed away, his face twisting with rage and betrayal. You can't do this, he shouted. I've done everything for this department, for this town, and this is how you repay me? You did it for yourself, Simone said coldly, and now, you're finally facing the consequences. As the officers cuffed Hawthorne, he turned his glare on Simone one last time. This isn't over, he snarled. You'll regret this. Simone met his gaze, her voice steady. No, you will. The aftermath of the confrontation was a blur. Hawthorne was led out of the station, his shouts fading into the distance. Sheriff Bryant retreated to his office, leaving the remaining officers to grapple with the fallout. Simone and Mitchell stayed behind, answering questions from a few curious officers who seemed genuinely shocked by the revelations. You did it, Mitchell said quietly, as they stepped outside into the cool night air. You brought him down. Simone shook her head. This is just the beginning. Hawthorne was a symptom, not the disease. We still have work to do. Mitchell nodded, his respect for her evident. Then let's get to it. As they walked to their cars, a faint unease settled over Simone Hawthorne's parting words, echoed in her mind, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. Corruption didn't die easily, and there were still others who would do whatever it took to protect themselves. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of relief. The first crack in Willow Creek's rotten foundation had been struck, and there was no turning back. The days following Deputy Hawthorne's arrest were a whirlwind for Willow Creek. News of the corruption scandal spread far beyond the small town's borders, drawing the attention of state and national media. Simone found herself at the center of it all, balancing interviews, legal meetings, and late-night calls with Mark Riley and Mitchell Harper. Hawthorne's arrest had been just the beginning. The documents Mitchell submitted to the Attorney General's office sparked a full-scale investigation into Willow Creek's leadership. Deputy Mayor Ellis resigned within 48 hours, his lawyer issuing a vague statement about prioritizing family matters. By the end of the week, Sheriff Bryant announced his retirement, though rumors swirled that he had been offered a deal to avoid prosecution in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation. Simone stood on the steps of the community center one chilly morning, staring out at the quiet town square. The once familiar streets looked different now, brighter, somehow, as if the weight of the corruption had lifted a veil from the town's eyes. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, and allowed herself a rare moment of peace. Inside the community center, volunteers bustled around tables covered with pamphlets, sign-up sheets, and stacks of donated supplies. The center had become a hub for the town's rebuilding efforts, spearheaded by a coalition of residents inspired by Simone's fight. Mark Riley waved her over from the corner, where he was sorting through paperwork. "Simone," he said, his voice filled with cautious optimism, "you won't believe this. We've already got commitments for the first phase of renovations, enough to cover the new roof and electrical work." Simone smiled, the news easing some of the tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. "That's incredible, Mark. The community is stepping up." Mark nodded, his expression turning serious. "They're stepping up because of you. You showed them what was possible." Simone shook her head. "This wasn't just me. It was you, Mitchell, Maria, and everyone else who refused to stay silent. Change doesn't happen alone." Mark smiled faintly, but his eyes were tired. "Still, I don't think we could have done it without you. You gave us hope." Simone didn't respond immediately. Hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered, but she was beginning to see its strength too. The people of Willow Creek were tired of being overlooked and mistreated. They were ready to fight for a better future, and Simone was determined to help them. Later that afternoon, Simone sat in the small office that had become her makeshift headquarters. Mitchell knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside, holding a stack of legal documents. "Good news," he said, placing the papers on her desk. "The state's already filed charges against Ellis. They're going after his financial assets to recover the stolen funds." Simone nodded, her mind already racing with ideas for how the recovered money could be used to revitalize the town. "That's a start. What about the sheriff's office?" Mitchell sighed, sinking into the chair across from her. "It'll take time to clean house, but the AG's office is appointing an independent oversight committee to review their operations. They've also reached out to the state police to provide temporary support." "That's something," Simone said, though her tone was cautious. "But it doesn't fix everything." Mitchell leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "No, but it's a foundation, and you've built it. You've given this town a chance to rebuild." Simone looked down at her hands, the weight of the past weeks settling over her. "I just hope it's enough." Mitchell smiled faintly. "It's more than enough. And it's not all on your shoulders, you know. The town's waking up. They're ready to do the work." That evening, Simone attended a town hall meeting in the same room where the confrontation with Hawthorne had taken place. The atmosphere was entirely different now, buzzing with energy and purpose. Residents stepped forward to voice their ideas for community programs, infrastructure improvements, and new leadership. For the first time, Simone saw hope shining in their eyes, replacing the fear and apathy that had held them back for so long. As the meeting wrapped up, a young girl approached Simone with a notebook clutched to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 12, her braids neatly tied with bright blue ribbons. "Dr. Bennett?" the girl asked shyly. Simone knelt to meet her at eye level. "Yes, sweetheart." The girl held out the notebook, her hands trembling slightly. "I wrote about you for my school project, You're My Hero." Simone's throat tightened, and she blinked back the sudden sting of tears. She took the notebook carefully, glancing at the neat handwriting and the hand-drawn picture of Simone standing in front of the community center. "Thank you," Simone said, her voice soft but steady. "This means so much to me. And you know what, you're a hero too. It takes courage to dream big and stand up for what's right." The girl's face lit up, and she nodded enthusiastically. "I want to be just like you someday." Simone smiled. "You'll be even better." As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of Simone's efforts became more apparent. The new leadership in town pledged to implement policies for greater transparency and accountability. Community members who had once stayed silent began organizing their own initiatives, from food drives to mentorship programs. Maria Vasquez, who had once been too afraid to speak out, became one of the center's most vocal advocates, leading workshops on workers' rights and civic engagement. Simone found herself busier than ever, balancing her work in Willow Creek with her responsibilities in Chicago. But despite the exhaustion, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had come back to her hometown to make a difference, and though the road ahead was long, she knew she was on the right path. One evening, as Simone packed up her office, Mitchell stopped by with a small box in his hands. He placed it on her desk with a smirk. "A little something for you." Simone opened the box to find a plaque engraved with the words, "To Dr. Simone Bennett, for lighting the way forward." She traced the lettering with her fingertips, her chest tightening. "Thank you, Mitchell. This means a lot." "You earned it," he said. "But don't get too comfortable, this fight isn't over." Simone chuckled softly. "It never is." As Simone drove back to her mother's house that night, the quiet streets of Willow Creek felt different. They still carried the weight of the past, but now they also held the promise of a better future. Pulling into the driveway, she sat in the car for a moment, reflecting on everything that had brought her to this point. The corruption, the resistance, the small victories that added up to something larger. It hadn't been easy, and it never would be, but it was worth it. She stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the cool night air. Looking up at the stars, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Willow Creek still had a long way to go, but it was no longer trapped in silence. Neither was she. The streets of Willow Creek were quieter now, but they no longer felt suffocating. The town's once familiar stillness carried a new energy, a pulse of movement, of possibility. Simone Bennett stood in front of the Willow Creek Community Center, its facade still weathered, but its doors bustling with life. Volunteers shuffled in and out, their hands full of donated supplies and construction materials. Laughter spilled from the small crowd gathered at the newly planted garden out front. Simone smiled faintly, the sight stirring a mix of pride and bittersweet emotion. This was what she had fought for, not perfection, but progress. Change didn't come all at once, nor was it ever simple, but here, in the small victories, she saw the beginnings of something better. Simone had returned to Willow Creek, expecting to find a town frozen in time, a place that had long resisted change. What she didn't anticipate was how much she would change in the process. Her journey had forced her to confront not only the systemic injustices that had plagued her hometown, but also the quiet weight of her own anger and fear. For years, Simone had carried the burden of knowing that no matter how far she climbed, no matter how many accolades she earned, there would always be people who saw only the color of her skin. People like Deputy Hawthorne, who wielded power not as a responsibility, but as a weapon. At first, Simone had tried to fight back the way she always had, calmly, methodically, proving herself in spaces where she was underestimated. But this time, it wasn't just about her. Willow Creek's corruption wasn't an isolated problem. It was a microcosm of broader systemic issues that extended far beyond the town's borders. Her fight became a symbol, not just of her personal resilience, but of the collective strength needed to dismantle those systems. Through it all, Simone learned that strength wasn't about suppressing her emotions, it was about channeling them. Her anger became fuel, her fear a reminder of what was at stake. And as she stood up to the forces trying to silence her, she found allies. People like Mark Riley, Maria Vasquez, and Mitchell Harper, who had been waiting for someone to ignite the spark of change. The events in Willow Creek underscored a painful truth. Systemic problems like racism, corruption, and abuse of power thrive in silence. The town's leadership had operated unchecked for years because those with power counted on people staying quiet, on their fear outweighing their outrage. But silence is not the absence of power. It is often the prelude to transformation. Simone's journey proved that when individuals and communities refuse to accept injustice, they can become catalysts for change. Her story was a testament to the idea that courage is contagious. One voice, raised against the tide, can inspire others to join the fight. Willow Creek's struggle wasn't unique. Across the country, countless towns grapple with similar issues, hidden beneath polite facades and long-standing traditions. The corruption in Willow Creek reflected the larger systemic injustices that marginalized communities face every day. Biased policing, unequal distribution of resources, and leaders who prioritize their own interests over the public good. Simone's fight served as a reminder that these systems are not immutable. They are made up of people, flawed, biased, and ultimately fallible. And because they are made by people, they can be changed by people. What had started as Simone's solitary fight quickly became a collective effort. The people of Willow Creek, once cowed into complacency, found their voices. The community center, long neglected, became a space for organizing, for healing, and for imagining a future that wasn't dictated by fear. Maria Vasquez, who had once been too afraid to speak up, emerged as a leader in her own right, organizing workshops and rallies. Mark Riley, whose initial courage had set the dominoes in motion, dedicated himself to rebuilding the town's infrastructure, one project at a time. And Mitchell Harper, the reluctant ally, became a steady presence in the movement, lending his experience and insight to guide the town forward. Their actions highlighted an essential truth: no one fights alone. Change requires collective effort. A web of people, each playing their part, supporting one another when the weight becomes too much to bear. Together, they proved that even the smallest community could take on the largest of systems when united by a shared purpose. Despite the progress, Simone knew the fight was far from over. The investigation into Willow Creek's leadership was ongoing, and there were still questions about how deep the corruption ran. While the state's intervention offered hope for reform, it also came with challenges. Trust in the town's institutions had been shattered, and rebuilding it would take years of consistent effort. Simone also grappled with the personal toll of the fight. The relentless pressure, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, they had left their mark. But she had no regrets. Every step of the journey had reaffirmed her commitment to justice, not just for herself, but for the community that had shaped her. As she prepared to leave Willow Creek and return to Chicago, Simone felt a sense of closure, even if the story wasn't finished. She knew she couldn't stay in her hometown forever. Her work as a surgeon was calling her back. But she also knew she would never truly leave. Willow Creek was a part of her, and she would always carry its lessons with her. On her final day in Willow Creek, Simone stood before a packed room at the community center. It was a mix of familiar faces, those who had marched with her, spoken out with her, and rebuilt with her. She addressed them with the same quiet strength that had carried her through the past months. "We've come a long way," she began, her voice steady. "But this isn't the end of the road. Change is a process, and it's not always easy. There will be setbacks, and there will be moments when it feels like we haven't made progress at all. But don't let that stop you." She scanned the room, meeting the eyes of Maria, Mark, Mitchell, and the young girl who had called her a hero. "Remember this: silence allows injustice to grow, but action, no matter how small, plants the seeds of change. You've already proven that you have the power to make a difference. Keep using it." The room erupted into applause, the sound filling the air like a promise. As Simone stepped down, Maria approached her, a mix of gratitude and determination in her expression. "You've given us so much," Maria said. "We'll keep fighting." Simone smiled, her heart full. "I know you will." As Simone drove out of Willow Creek, the town's streets bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, she allowed herself one last moment of reflection. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her the value of integrity and perseverance. She thought about the people of Willow Creek, who had shown her the power of community, and she thought about the long road ahead, not just for her hometown, but for every place grappling with injustice. Simone's fight wasn't over, and it likely never would be. But as she drove toward the horizon, she felt a quiet certainty. The weight of silence had been lifted, and in its place, a new legacy was taking root. A legacy of courage, resilience, and hope.